The cold concrete of my own front porch felt like ice against my cheek as the electrical surge from the taser finally ebbed, leaving me smelling of burnt ozone and the metallic tang of my own betrayal. I lay there, paralyzed, watching the polished black boots of the man I had once called a brother-in-law stand over me while my own sister stood in the shadows of the doorway, clutching a manila envelope that contained the death warrant for our relationship. I was a former deputy with 12 years of service and a clean record, yet here I was being treated like a common criminal on the threshold of the home I had spent my entire life protecting, all because the people I trusted most had decided that my existence was an obstacle to their greed. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me, even as my muscles spasmed and my vision blurred. I had spent a decade wearing the same badge Marcus now used as a shield for his malice, and I had spent 30 years protecting the woman who was now whispering instructions to him on how to finish me off. Before the sirens and the screaming, my life had a rhythm that was as steady and comforting as the ticking of my father's old grandfather clock in the hallway. I had retired from the sheriff's department 6 months earlier, not because I wanted to, but because a pursuit on a rainy Tuesday ended with a spinal injury that made the weight of a duty belt unbearable. I had transitioned into a quiet life of physical therapy and restoration, taking over the family estate after our father passed away. It was a sprawling Victorian farmhouse on the edge of the county, a place of wraparound porches, creaking floorboards, and the pervasive scent of dried lavender and old books. Dad had left the house to me entirely, a decision that was clearly stated in a will he had drafted and notarized 2 years before his heart finally gave out. He knew I loved every splinter of that wood, every drafty window, and every memory baked into the kitchen tiles. My sister, Elena, had received her inheritance in cash and investments, a sum that should have set her up for life if she hadn't spent her years chasing a social status that was always just out of her reach. At first, the transition was peaceful. I'd spend my mornings on the porch with a heavy ceramic mug of black coffee, watching the fog lift off the meadows, feeling a sense of belonging that I had lacked during my years on patrol. Elena would visit occasionally, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood, a stark contrast to the soft thud of my wool socks. She'd bring Marcus, her husband of 5 years, a man who had scraped into the city police force and seemed to carry a permanent chip on his shoulder about my superior rank and the respect I had earned in the community. Marcus was the kind of cop who wore his uniform like a weapon, rather than a tool of service. He was loud, prone to joking about the people he arrested in ways that made my skin crawl, and he possessed a subtle, simmering resentment toward anyone he deemed lesser. I had seen the way he looked at the diverse neighborhood that was slowly growing around our rural pocket, with a sneer and a hand instinctively hovering over his holster. I'd always kept him at arm's length, but for Elena's sake, I played the role of the welcoming host. I'd cook them dinner, listen to their complaints about debt and the rising cost of their lifestyle, and I'd offer the warmth of the home they didn't own. The house was more than just a roof. It sat on 40 acres of prime land that developers were suddenly salivating over. I didn't care about the money. I cared about the oak tree where Dad had built us a swing and the garden where Mom's roses still bloomed every June. But to Elena and Marcus, those 40 acres were a winning lottery ticket that I was selfishly sitting on. I started noticing the changes about 3 months ago. It began with concern. Elena would drop by unannounced, her eyes roaming over the slight limp in my stride or the way I gripped the banister when my back flared up. "Sarah, honey, you look exhausted," she'd say, her voice dripping with a sugary, fake sympathy that never quite reached her eyes. "This house is so big. It's a lot for a disabled person to handle alone. Maybe it's time we talk about a managed facility, or at least selling this place and getting you a nice, flat condo in the city." I'd always laugh it off, telling her I was fine, that the physical therapy was working. But the concern soon turned into an interrogation. Marcus started asking about the deed, about the taxes, about the safety of the property. He'd show up in his cruiser during his shift, leaning against my kitchen counter, his eyes scanning my personal papers if I left them out. He'd make comments about how the wrong kind of people were moving into the county and how a woman living alone was a target. "You're not on the force anymore, Sarah," he'd say, his tone low and mocking. "You're just a civilian with a bad back. You can't hold the line out here." I didn't see the trap being laid. I didn't see the way they were documenting my every move, my every doctor's appointment, and every moment of vulnerability. I was so caught up in the nostalgia of my home and the slow pace of my recovery that I missed the predator's shadow crossing my threshold. I thought family was a sanctuary. I didn't realize that to Elena and Marcus, I wasn't a sister or a colleague. I was a tenant in a building they felt entitled to own, and they were tired of waiting for me to leave voluntarily. The first real crack appeared on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week before the world ended. I was in the basement, sorting through Dad's old workshop, when I heard the front door open. I hadn't heard a knock. When I climbed the stairs, I found Marcus in the living room. He wasn't in uniform, but he had that look, the cold, detached gaze of a man who was about to serve a warrant. He was holding a folder, and the way he gripped it told me everything I needed to know. The peace was over, and the war for my father's legacy had begun in earnest. Marcus didn't flinch when I walked into the room. He didn't even have the decency to look guilty for being in my house uninvited. He just tapped the folder against his thigh, his eyes drifting over the crown molding of the ceiling, as if he were already calculating the cost of a remodel. He told me he was just checking in, because Elena was worried I hadn't answered her last 3 texts. It was a lie. My phone had been silent all morning. When I asked him how he got in, he held up a spare key I had given Elena for emergencies. He didn't offer to return it. Instead, he started talking about the neighborhood again, his voice dropping into that conspiratorial, ugly tone he used when he thought he was among his own. He mentioned the new family that had moved into the old Miller place down the road, a young black couple, both doctors, who had spent the last month quietly restoring the property. To Marcus, they weren't neighbors, they were an infestation. He spoke about how their presence would tank the property value and how people like that always brought trouble with them. I felt a surge of cold fury. I reminded him that I had patrolled this county for 12 years and that the only trouble I saw in the area was his attitude. His face darkened, a muscle leaping in his jaw. He told me I was soft and that my injury had clearly affected my judgment. He left then, but the air in the house felt oily, stained by his presence. Over the next 2 weeks, the warning signs began to pile up like dry brush before a fire. I received a phone call from my insurance agent, asking why I had requested a change of beneficiary on my homeowner's policy. I hadn't. Then, I noticed a white SUV idling at the end of my driveway on 3 separate occasions. When I walked down to investigate, it sped off, but not before I caught a glimpse of a professional-grade camera in the passenger seat. Someone was surveilling me. I called Elena, my voice trembling with a mix of pain and anxiety, but she brushed me off. She told me I was becoming paranoid and suggested that perhaps my pain medication was making me hallucinate. That was the cruelest cut of all. I barely took the pills the doctors gave me, fearing the fog they induced. I preferred the sharp, honest bite of the spinal pain to the numbness of the narcotics. But Elena was already planting the seeds of a narrative. Sarah is unstable. Sarah is confused. Sarah can't take care of herself. I decided then to take a precaution I should have taken months ago. I installed a high-definition doorbell camera and 2 discrete security lights. I didn't tell Elena or Marcus. It was the only thing that made me feel like a deputy again, protecting my perimeter, even if the threat was coming from my own blood. The point of no return arrived on a humid Thursday afternoon. The heat was a physical weight, making my back throb with every breath. I had gone to the mailbox to find a thick, official-looking envelope from a law firm I didn't recognize. My heart hammered against my ribs as I tore it open right there on the gravel. It wasn't a bill or a solicitation. It was a formal notice of intent to vacate. The letter stated that the property had been sold to a private development group and that, as a temporary tenant, I had 30 days to remove my belongings before the locks were changed. The world didn't just slow down, it stopped. The chirping of the cicadas became a deafening roar in my ears. I felt a sudden, violent wave of nausea that forced me to lean against the mailbox post. My hands shook so violently that the paper rattled like a dead leaf. I scrambled back into the house, my boots thundering on the porch, and dove into the small home office where I kept my father's original will and the deed to the house. I pulled the heavy metal filing cabinet open, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I reached for the blue folder that held my life together, but my hand met empty space. I pulled the drawer out further, my pulse thudding in my throat until I could taste copper. The folder was gone. In its place was a single, photocopied sheet of paper. It was a power of attorney document, dated 4 weeks prior. It bore my name, my social security number, and a signature that looked terrifyingly like my own, a perfect, fluid imitation of my handwriting before the accident had made my grip shaky. Attached to it was a sales agreement for the house and the 40 acres. The purchase price was a fraction of the land's value, just enough to cover Elena's mounting credit card debts, and perhaps a down payment on the new house Marcus had been bragging about. The buyer was a shell company, and the witness signatures at the bottom were Marcus's best friend from the precinct and a notary I'd never heard of. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. I collapsed into my office chair, my lungs refusing to take in air. My own sister had stolen my identity. My brother-in-law, a sworn officer of the law, had forged a legal document to strip me of my home, my heritage, and my future. They weren't just waiting for me to leave, they had already erased me. I looked at my hands, the hands that had handcuffed murderers and comforted victims, and I saw them trembling with a primal, agonizing terror. I wasn't just a deputy anymore. I wasn't even a homeowner. In the eyes of the law, thanks to these papers, I was a ghost haunting a house that had already been sold out from under me. Then, the terror turned into something else. It was a cold, crystalline spark of rage that started in the base of my spine and radiated outward. They thought I was broken. They thought my injury had made me a victim. They thought that because I was a woman alone in a big house, I would simply fold and disappear into whatever managed facility they had picked out for me. They had forgotten one very important thing. I knew the law better than Marcus ever would, and I knew how to hold a line. I grabbed my phone, my fingers steadying as the adrenaline took over, and I dialed the one person I knew could help me burn their scheme to the ground. But before the first ring even finished, I heard the heavy, unmistakable sound of a cruiser pulling into my gravel driveway. I looked at my security monitor. Marcus was stepping out of his car, hand on his belt, his face set in a mask of professional coldness. He wasn't coming for coffee. He was coming to finish it. I didn't wait for him to knock. I met him on the porch, the forged power of attorney clutched in my hand like a shield. The summer air is thick enough to choke on, and Marcus stood there in his full uniform, the sun glinting off his badge. The same badge I had worn with pride, now tarnished by the man behind it. He didn't look like a brother-in-law. He looked like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "You need to leave, Marcus," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I know what you did. I found the papers. I know about the shell company. I know you forged my signature." Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just hooked his thumbs into his duty belt, a slow, mocking smile spreading across his face. Sarah, look at you. You're shaking. You're pale. You're clearly having another one of your episodes. Elena and I have been so worried about your mental decline since the accident." "Don't you dare," I hissed. "I'm as sharp as I've ever been. This is forgery. This is a felony. I'm calling the sheriff." "The sheriff is a friend of mine, Sarah, and he knows you've been struggling with the medication you're taking for that back of yours," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous purr. He stepped closer, invading my personal space. "We're just trying to help you. The neighborhood is changing. It's getting dangerous. We saw you talking to those people down at the Miller place.
We know you're not thinking straight, hanging out with that element. You're putting yourself at risk. We sold the house to keep you safe, and to make sure the right kind of people develop this land." "The right kind of people?" I felt a surge of bile. "You mean people who look like you? You're selling my father's legacy because you're a bigot who's deep in debt." The smile vanished. His eyes turned into chips of flint. Before he could respond, Elena's car shrieked into the driveway, gravel flying. She jumped out, her face a mask of practiced distress. She ran up the porch steps, trying to grab my arm, but I recoiled as if she were a viper. "Sarah, please!" she cried, her voice high and performative. "We're doing this for your own good. You can't live here anymore. You're obsessed with this place and it's rotting your brain. We've already signed the commitment papers for a 72-hour observation."
The ambulance is on its way. The betrayal felt like a second spinal injury, a paralyzing blow that left me breathless. Commitment papers? You're trying to have me sectioned to cover up a theft? "We're trying to save you from yourself," Elena yelled, her facade finally cracking to reveal the greed underneath. "Dad should have left this house to me. I'm the one with the family. I'm the one who needs the money. You're just a broken-down cop sitting on a gold mine while I drown." "I'm not leaving," I said, my voice a whisper of ice. "And if you don't get off my property in 30 seconds, I'm calling it in. I have the original will at my lawyer's office, Elena. I moved it a month ago. You stole a copy. You have nothing." That was the first twist. A lie I told to see them crumble. It worked. Elena's face went white, and she turned to Marcus, her eyes wide with panic. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus looked at his wife, then back at me. I saw the moment his professional restraint snapped. He wasn't a cop anymore. He was a cornered animal with a badge. "You think you're so smart," Marcus spat, his hand moving to his holster. "You think because you were a deputy in this podunk county you're untouchable? You're a liability, Sarah. You're a drug-addled, unstable former officer who's resisting a lawful wellness check." "Lawful?" I laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "You're out of your jurisdiction, Marcus. You have no papers, no doctors, and no right to be here." "I have my word against yours," he said. He looked over his shoulder at the empty road, then back at me. "And Elena will testify that you attacked us, that you've been threatening the neighbors, that you've become a sympathizer to the radicals moving in down the street. It's a tragedy, really. A hero cop losing her mind." He moved so fast I didn't have time to react. He grabbed my arm, twisting it behind my back with a technique I knew all too well. The pain in my spine exploded, a white-hot spear of agony that made my knees buckle. "Stop it!" I screamed. "Marcus, stop!" Elena stood by, her hands over her mouth, but she didn't move to help. She didn't even look away. She just watched as her husband slammed me against the porch railing. "Get the zip ties from the car, Elena," Marcus barked. I struggled, my fingers clawing at the wood of the railing, my breath coming in sob-like gasps. "You're finished, Marcus. I have a camera. It's all on camera." He froze for a split second, his eyes darting to the ceiling of the porch. He saw the small black dome of the doorbell cam I had installed. For a moment, I saw genuine fear in his eyes, but then it was replaced by a cold, murderous resolve. "The footage won't matter if you're dead or in a padded cell, Sarah," he whispered in my ear. He shoved me away, and as I stumbled, trying to catch my balance, he reached for his belt. I saw the yellow casing of the taser. "Marcus, don't!" Elena shrieked, but it was too late. The world shattered. The pop of the taser was followed by the most horrific sensation I have ever endured. It wasn't just pain. It was a total takeover of my nervous system. 5,000 volts ripped through my muscles, locking my jaw, curling my fingers into claws, and throwing my head back against the siding of the house. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. I felt my heart skip a beat, then another. I collapsed. My head hit the porch floor with a sickening thud. I lay there, twitching, the scent of my own scorched skin filling my nostrils. Through the haze of the electrical storm in my brain, I heard Marcus's voice, calm and clinical. "She's resisting,"
he said, clearly speaking into his radio now, calling for backup. I had to deploy the taser. Subject is Sarah Miller. She's armed and highly unstable. Send an ambulance and additional units. Tell them she's been making threats against the community, specifically the new residents. She's gone full radical. He looked down at me, his boot inches from my face. He didn't know I was still conscious. He didn't know that my hand was slowly, agonizingly crawling toward the hidden pocket in my porch chair, where I kept my old service phone, the one that was already recording every word he said. One more twist, Marcus, I thought through the pain. You forgot I was a deputy. We never go anywhere without a backup plan. The taser prongs were still buried in my flesh, the thin wires connecting me to Marcus's malice like a puppet on strings. But as the involuntary tremors in my limbs began to subside, replaced by a cold, searing clarity, something inside me shifted. The sister who had wanted to save Elena, the woman who had tried to play nice for the sake of family peace, she died on that porch floor. In her place stood the deputy. I didn't feel the pain in my back anymore. I felt the weight of every law Marcus had just broken, and I felt the tactical precision of a hunter who had just seen her prey step into the light.
Marcus was still on the radio, his voice a masterpiece of manufactured panic, describing me as a violent, mentally unstable suspect with radicalized views. He was trying to justify the tasing by painting me as a threat to the very neighbors he himself despised. It was a classic blue wall tactic. Frame the victim as the aggressor before the backup arrives. But Marcus had made a fatal mistake. He assumed I was playing by his rules. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the cool glass of my backup phone. I didn't call for help. I didn't need to. I had already set the dead man switch on my security app. Because I hadn't just installed a doorbell camera, I had installed a system that live streamed directly to a cloud server, shared with my attorney and the Internal Affairs Division of the State Police. They weren't just seeing the aftermath, they had been watching the whole thing in real time. "The recording is live, Marcus," I whispered, my voice sounding like gravel grinding together. He stopped mid-sentence, his radio still keyed. He looked down at me, his face a mask of confusion. "What did you say?" "The camera," I said, nodding weakly toward the small black orb above the door. "It's not just recording to a hard drive, it's streaming. My lawyer is watching you right now. The state police are watching you. They heard everything, the forgery, the threats, the right kind of people comment. You didn't just tase a suspect, Marcus. You tased a cooperating witness in a federal civil rights investigation." The color drained from his face so fast, it was as if a plug had been pulled. Behind him, Elena let out a whimpering sound, her eyes darting to the camera. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant, rising wail of sirens. But these weren't the local sirens Marcus was expecting. These were the high-pitched, aggressive shrieks of the state troopers. When the first 3 cruisers roared into the driveway, they didn't park behind Marcus's car. They boxed him in. 4 troopers stepped out, their long guns leveled not at me, but at the man in the polished uniform standing over me. "Drop the taser, Marcus. Hands behind your head, now." The voice of Sergeant Miller, a man I had trained 10 years ago, boomed across the yard. Marcus tried to bluster. He tried to use his brotherhood card. "Hey guys, wait. She's unstable. I'm conducting a wellness check." "We saw the feed, Marcus," Miller said, his voice cold and disgusted. "We saw the whole thing. Get on the ground." I watched from the floor as my brother-in-law, the man who thought he could steal my life with a forged signature and a spark of electricity, was shoved face down into the same gravel he had used to terrorize me. The click of the handcuffs was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Elena was screaming, hysterical now, as another trooper informed her she was being detained for questioning regarding identity theft and fraud. As they lifted me onto the gurney, Sergeant Miller leaned over me, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder. "We got it all, Sarah. The forgery, the assault, and the stuff he said about the neighbors. That's a hate crime enhancement in this state. He's never wearing a badge again." I looked over at Elena, who was being led to a separate cruiser. She looked small, pathetic, and entirely hollow. I had one last thing to say to her. "You didn't just lose the house, Elena," I said, the words cutting through her screams. "You lost the only person who would have ever forgiven you." The legal battle that followed was a scorched earth campaign. We didn't just go after Marcus for the assault. We went after the entire department that had allowed him to thrive, and the development company that had conspired with him to steal my land. The power of attorney was proven to be a crude forgery within 48 hours. The notary Marcus had used turned state's evidence the moment he was threatened with a racketeering charge. The lawsuit settled 18 months later. $6.8 million. It was a record for the county, a figure so large it forced a total overhaul of the local police department and the permanent decertification of Marcus. He's currently serving 8 years in a state facility. Elena received a suspended sentence in exchange for her testimony against him, but she walked away with nothing. No money, no house, and no sister. She sends me letters from a cramped apartment in the city, begging for her share. I burn them unopened. Today the porch is quiet again. The smell of lavender is back, stronger than the scent of ozone. I used a portion of the settlement to establish a land trust, ensuring that my father's 40 acres can never be developed. It's a sanctuary now, not just for me, but for the community. I'm sitting in my usual chair, the ceramic mug warm in my hands. My back still aches on rainy days, but the limp is almost gone. Down the road, I can see Dr.
Aris and his wife working on their garden. We're having dinner at their place tonight. I look at the doorbell camera, the little black eye that saved my life. I used to think that being a deputy was about the badge and the authority. I was wrong. It's about the truth. And the truth is, I didn't need a uniform to protect my home. I just needed the courage to let the world see exactly who my enemies were. I take a sip of my coffee, the fog lifting off the meadow just like it always does. My life isn't what I thought it would be, but it's mine. Every board, every nail, and every memory. Some people think you can bury the past under a pile of forged papers and intimidation. But they forget. The earth always eventually spits out what doesn't belong. And I belong right here.